Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to introduce our two speakers for our last session here, and then we will get right started. So our next two speakers are Jessica Schmidt and Ava Craven. Jessica is an undergraduate student at St. Olaf in Northfield. She's a junior studying biology and mathematics with a concentration in statistics and data science. And Ava is an undergraduate at St. Olaf as well, studying environmental studies and education.
Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Ava.
I'm Jessica.
And our project that we are doing, or our project is using banding data to understand passerine crèching and anti-crèching in the Midwest. So let's begin. So this is kind of just a breakdown of what we'll be talking about today. Basically, we're just going to tell you a story about what we've been doing, what we've learned, what we want to do next. So, yeah. A little bit about who we are. We're from St. Olaf, and this past summer we were part of a program called CURI, which is Collaborative Undergraduate Research and Inquiry through St. Olaf College. And we worked with Dr. Sean Peterson at St. Olaf through the MAPS bird banding station at St. Olaf. And with that, we also did a side project focused on crèching. So what is crèching? We'll break that down a little bit. So crèching is when chicks from different parents join together to form groups called crèches. And this can happen between birds of the same species and also across species. And there's also varied levels of parental care. So sometimes it could be a lot of moms with only caring for their own offspring, and other times it could be only like two mothers caring for an entire crèche and across species, which is kind of interesting. And there's a lot of benefits to crèching. One of it is it gives time for parents to recover. There's also a lot of socialization benefits and just an overall reduction in predation for juvenile birds. Oh, it also happens more commonly in shorebird species. So the fact that we're looking into passerine species, this is less widely known, which is why we wanted to look into it. But crèching is also very similar to, I think, a more commonly known behavior, which is mixed species flocking. And this happens across adult species, and it's when multiple species move and forage together in a group. And this can happen, it happens mostly during non-breeding season, specifically in winter or during migration. This also commonly appears to be an adaptation to difficult conditions or when species are under stress, which is something we'll look into a little bit more when it comes to crèching as well later on. And also mixed species flocking depends a lot on things mostly, but diet is a big part as to why species will mix species crèche, especially when it comes to mixed species flock, sorry. But yeah, especially with insectivore species. And there's a lot of benefits when it comes to mixed species flocking as well, including reduced risk in predation and just an overall greater accessibility to natural resources in foraging. So there's a lot of positive social behaviors, but this one we also wanted to talk about, which is a negative social behavior called agonistic behavior. One example of this is the northern cardinal biting my hand right there. Yeah, this is when birds will be aggressive or defensive with social interactions, and this happens mostly during mating and breeding season. So given this, a little bit about what crèching is and similar behaviors, we wanted to look into specifically to what extent does crèching occur within passerine or songbird species, and is there any antisocial behavior present in passerine species as well? And if so, why is that the case?
Yeah, so since that's the study question we wanted to look at, and we were doing our summer research running a MAPS bird banding station, we decided to use the MAPS data set in order to try to answer this question. So the MAPS program is a bird banding program. It stands for Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. Historically, there's over 1,400 stations across the US and Canada, which you can see on that map, and over millions of birds banded. And we are specifically taking the data from the MAPS data set that has juvenile birds. So the MAPS program runs to really capture that breeding season, so it runs like May to August-ish. And so for our purposes, the juveniles we're capturing have since left the nest, but they haven't gone onto any migration yet. And so normally if you want to study something like crèching, if you're studying it in like penguins, you'd have to follow around all those little birds, maybe use radio transmitters. That's a lot. and our college is only going to give us so much money. So instead, we wanted to find an easier way to do it. So we're using the fact that when you band a bird in the MAPS data set, not only do you record a lot of information about its weight, its age, its wing chord, you also record what net you caught it in and at what time you caught it. So we are using the fact that two birds are caught in the same net at the same time as kind of a proxy for crèching behavior. So that's what we're saying is indicating crèching. Obviously, that's not the case all the time, but we can use it as an indication of when that behavior might be happening and make it a lot easier for us to study it. And we decided to specifically focus on the Midwest region as defined by that map. So we took our MAPS data set, took only the juvenile records, and then only those in the Midwest. And then we also further restricted it to species that had at least 100 encounters in that data, so we had enough data to make a reasonable model. And this left us with about 50,000 records of 60 total species. All of those species were either passerines or near passerines, so woodpeckers and one hummingbird species. And now, don't get scared by the graphs, but we took all that data and we did a binomial linear model. And basically what we're doing here is saying, are we more likely to have a juvenile of one species in the net if we already have a juvenile of another species in the net, or does that other species presence maybe reduce it or not affect the odds of catching that second species? So we did that for every single pairing of species, and when we did that, we only looked at the ones that actually had enough overlap in their locations. So here, this is an example. We have the mourning warbler on the bottom and the Nashville warbler along here, and then we just have 0 meaning that the bird wasn't there, 1, 2, and 3 indicating how many juveniles were there. And we can see from this trend that if there was a mourning warbler in the net, we were more likely to catch a Nashville warbler than if there wasn't a mourning warbler in the net. And so like I said, we did that for all of our 60 species pair. This leaves us with 3,600 pairings. That's a lot, but only half of them actually had enough overlap in their range for us to make a viable model. But that's still a lot, and that means we have a higher chance of getting false positives if we're using kind of the standard p-value less than 0.05. We're going to have a lot of false positives. So we did a correction so that we had a much lower threshold for our p-value in order to really be able to say our results are significant. So this is kind of an overview of the results we had. We had 17 species that had at least one positive association with another species, and that means that you were more likely to catch that species in the net if the bird of the other species was there than if it wasn't. And so that's what we're kind of calling crèching behavior. Like I said before, it's technically just an indication of that behavior. We can't say for sure that's what it is, but we're going to be saying that. And then we also had 18 species that had the opposite, where they had a negative association, so they were less likely to be caught when there was another bird in the net. And so we took to calling that anti-crèching, since it was kind of the opposite of what we were looking at. And that's something we didn't really find described anywhere in any research, so that was fun, a fun discovery for us to make. And then we had 4 species that happened to do both, so they had at least one positive association and at least one negative association. And then 29 of the species we looked at didn't have any. And we also looked at just whether a species had a positive association with juveniles of the same species, and as you might expect, almost all of them did. There was only 2 of those 60 that did not, which we'll talk about. So this is a fun overview of those positive associations. Each of the bubbles are just labeled by the 4-letter alpha code for the species. And you can see we kind of have this big group over here with the Nashville warbler at the center. We have another big group over here, and then a lot of kind of smaller groups. And we've also color-coded this one by population growth and decline. This is based on global population growth and decline trends, but yellow indicates a declining population, blue indicates generally increasing population. And we're just going to take a quick look to zoom in on some of these so you can see them a bit better. This is that big one that I was talking about first, where we're centered around the Nashville warbler, and it had the most positive associations of any of our species. It has 7, and they're all other warblers. And then we have a couple of offshoots here with the least flycatcher and the sparrow and the robin. And we have a lot of declining species in here. Here's our next biggest one, which is really centered around that Carolina chickadee and the tufted titmouse. And then we have a couple offshoots with the woodpeckers. And then we have this really interesting one where we have the brown-headed cowbird made it into our web. And that's interesting because those are a parasitic species that are laying their eggs in other birds' nests. So you'd think they wouldn't be getting along with other birds, but they did have these positive associations with 2 warbler species. And then just a quick run through a lot of the smaller ones, don't have much to say about them. These ones, it's a lot of our larger birds. We had the blue jay, Baltimore oriole, grosbeak in here, and that kind of seems to make sense because we had the warblers before, so similar birds seem to have positive associations with similar birds. And these kind of agree. We have some thrushes and some warblers again doing that. And then we have this one where we have the eastern bluebird, chipping sparrow, yellow-bellied sapsucker. If anyone has ideas on why those birds like each other, please share. No clue. There's always exceptions. And then this graph is of those anti-Crèching negative associations that we found. And this is really just one big interconnected web. And we have kind of a mix of species that are declining and growing. And it's also a lot of more reciprocal relationships where that negative association is going both ways. And we kind of have three main species in here. We have the great catbird, which makes sense. Those guys are really annoying. The song sparrow, and then the black-capped chickadee, which was kind of an interesting one because those guys are known to be hanging out in mixed species flocks a lot in the winter, but they're really big in our anti-Crèching web, so as juveniles, they don't really like it.
Okay, so Jessica did a really nice job breaking down kind of the relationships between all of these birds, and then this graph kind of looks into the proportions of these behaviors or associations across species. So again, the alpha codes are right on the bottom, and then this key on the side is showing that the negative or anti-Crèching associations are red, neutral is blue, positive is green, or that's like the Crèching behavior. Yellow is for the times that they crushed or hung out with those of the same species, and then gray is when they were caught alone. So there's a lot going on in this graph, but really the main things to focus on is the four species that are the biggest anti-crushers, which are the song sparrow, the gray catbird, the black-capped chickadee, and the downy woodpecker. And another thing that's interesting to look at here is that the gray bar, so the amount of time that these species have spent alone, is much larger than the crushers or other species overall. And speaking of crushers, this is the warbler web. And as you can see here, the Nashville warbler and the chestnut-sided warbler, thank you, those are the biggest crushers, and you can tell by the huge green bar that's right there. But overall, these birds are just a lot more social in general. They just like hanging out with any birds and anyone, as you can see by the lack of gray that's present. So this is diving a little bit more into kind of comparing species to species. So this is comparing black-capped chickadee and the Carolina chickadee. And these species is really interesting to look at because they're very similar in a lot of ways in other behaviors, and they look the same. Really, they just have a different range. But it's also interesting that the black-capped chickadee is a huge anti-crusher, and the Carolina chickadee is a big crusher. So that's very interesting to look at, and we don't quite know why, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Here's looking more into the brown-headed cowbird associations. So there were positive associations with the yellow warbler and the blue-winged warbler. And the fact that they have positive associations kind of indicates that these species are capable of growing their own birds while also being able to raise the brown-headed cowbirds as well. And it's also interesting to look at that this yellow bar here among the brown-headed cowbirds, that even though brown-headed cowbirds were raised separately because their eggs were laid in random birds' nests, they were still able to find each other and hang out with each other as juveniles. And then lastly, this is looking at the mourning warbler and the yellow-bellied sapsucker. These were the only two species that didn't significantly hang out with their own species, which is really interesting, and we don't really know why, especially given the mourning warbler has a lot of time that it's spent with other birds, just not themselves. And this is also interesting to compare to the red-eyed vireo, which is very much evenly spread across all associations and interactions. So given what we found, we wanted to look a little bit into more as to why we think Crèching and anti-Crèching is present within passerines. So these is kind of our four main hypotheses as to why we think this could be happening. The first one is breeding season, so the time in which different species breed may impact which species they overlap with. So yeah, that could definitely be a factor. Other behaviors that are present among species, so if their parents are extraterritorial and protective, maybe that means that they're more anti-crusher or they don't crush, whereas if those species are mixed species flocking as adults, maybe that means that they could be crushers as juveniles. Diet could possibly be a factor, especially because, as I talked about earlier, that insectivores, they really like to mix species flock, so this could be a reason why juveniles crush. And then lastly, population size. So if a species is growing or decreasing in population, it may influence who crushes with who or why they're crushing. And then this graph is definitely interesting because it shows a little bit as to I'll just explain it first. But so this is breaking down the types of diets of different species. So the blue is insectivore pairings with omnivore and frugivore, and then green is omnivore pairings, and yellow is frugivore pairings. And as you can see in the crushing side, almost 50% of crushers are insectivore pairings or associations, whereas anti-crushing is much more evenly spread across all diets, which is cool.
So kind of getting into the theme of this whole conference, what does this tell us about the state of our birds? How are our birds doing? Well, from those graphs that I showed you guys earlier, we saw that there kind of seems to be a trend with population growth and decline and who's crushing and who's not. And if that's the case, then it also means that as more populations start to decline, that could affect these associations that we're seeing, whether it's how much a bird crushes or who it's crushing with. And it's also possible that if we can notice this behavior earlier, it could even be a signal for how the birds are declining. So we might see that their populations are going to start to decline if we observe this behavior more often. And this gets into what we were talking about earlier with the black-capped chickadee and the Carolina chickadee. One thing we noticed based on the global trend estimates is that the black-capped chickadee was generally increasing and the Carolina chickadee was generally decreasing, and it was the decreasing species that is the big crusher, whereas the increasing one is the big anti-crusher. So there's a potential that crushing is something that these species may be doing more as their populations are having more trouble. So that's pretty much all of our results and our speculation on why those might be happening. And there's a lot we want to do with this moving forward. A lot of it has to do with how certain we are of stuff. So we'd love to figure out if those causes of behavior that we just told you about may actually be correct or not. Another thing is, as we mentioned, this is all an indication that this behavior is happening, but we don't have direct observation of those juveniles hanging out together. So that's something that we want to do moving forward. And then also just expanding our results beyond the Midwest to more species and more locations. And we want to give our great thank you to Professor Sean Peterson, who has helped us both throughout the summer and through this last semester. He has been a great help. Also the MAPS program for letting us use their data, and all these people who gave us some funding. And thank you all for listening.
All right, we've got some good time for questions. Are there any questions out there? Feel free to raise your hand, and Dick and I will come find you. Are we sure there's no questions? We've got one, okay.
Did the range that the birds were found in, that you could tell from the information you had, did that affect any of your numbers? You know, whether it was good habitat or it was urban or rural, agriculture versus forested in some of these?
I don't think we had a lot of information on that, so not something we were taking particularly into account. Thank you.
Did you do a literature search to see if anyone had observed crashing in these kinds of birds? I mean, there's been years and hours of bird observations.
Yeah, we did do a bit of a literature search, and most of the articles we could find were on like penguins or eiders and stuff like that. We only had some anecdotes of this being observed in the passerine species, which is why we wanted to look into it, but we couldn't find anything in particular that was talking about passerines. But if you know of any, that'd be cool.
I mean, mostly it's, like we talked about, it's really hard to observe crushing, and then especially with passerines, it's really hard to see. And then with anti-crushing, like there was just nothing that we could find out there on that as well. So yeah, also if you guys see anything about that too, let us know.
Did you have any information on recaptures and consistent associations between the same birds?
We did not particularly look into that. I think it's something we could definitely look into. That'd be a good thing. But we didn't do it for this analysis.
Yeah, that would be cool though.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you both so much.
Thank you.